Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you are watching this session. We are back with another deck tech. And today, to your surprise, it is HEI BAI, a deck that I have experimented with as a control variant from the very moment that people realized this could be a thing in Duel Commander. But it was fun to play the deck. But I thought, if we have a commander that can actually do something around shrines, why not leaning a bit more into that? And in addition to that, cut the entire counter magic package, add much more aggression, and try to include some flicker things, a couple of more shrines, and just use that or go a bit more into that direction. I built this, I don't know, shortly after we played the focus session with the control variant. I had lots of fun with it. I even brought it to a tournament in Strasbourg, and the result was not too bad. Obviously, it was not too crazy because the deck is very grindy and sometimes takes a longer time to win your games. But the 99 can sometimes compensate for that. So let's have a look at that. For the Planeswalkers, there's not that much to say. Minskaboo is an auto-include into most decks that have an aggressive game plan and that play Gruul colors. Oko is a strongly debated card, I would say. In some situations, it is definitely not the best card, but I think for as long as your deck supports some dorks, it's fine to have that as a turn 2 play. Sometimes even in the later stage, it's still useful, but sometimes it can also be very clunky. So that's I think it's more like I like this card include rather than this is a crazy power include that you have to play in 2026. I'm not necessarily sure whether or not that's the case anymore. Over to the creatures. I included the best 5 dorks. I don't want to dilute my deck with too many 1-drops, or not necessarily 1-drops, but dorks, since naturally we don't have a 3-drop in the command zone to make use of that. So the lineup is a bit awkward sometimes. If you have too many dorks, then you end up with maybe a 2-drop and another 1-drop, or if you don't have like a 3-drop filling the turn 2 play, then it feels kind of useless to have the dog laying around. That's why I decided to go for the best ones. We have Mother of Runes in addition, protecting all the other creatures, as well as HEI BAI. We have Oswald Pride. I think this card is something that you, in a strategy like this, is something that you definitely want to go for. If you have a look at the colors, it's basically a Junt deck with some white cards, and blue is really only a splash. I think I have 3 cards that feature blue at all. There's Omnav, there is Essence Flux, and the Sanctum. Sanctum is a card that you basically don't want to cast. 4 cards actually. So we have 2 Sanctums, Sancti, whatever, with blue pips. But those are cards that you want to search for rather than hard cast them. So we basically have 2 cards. That's it for the 1-drops. Then for the 2-drops, also Raw Power, Ajani, Emperor of Bones has some cool interactions with some cards that we play, but also, the power plays around that card, stealing something from your opponent's graveyard, getting it back, while having some incidental graveyard hate, I thought was not too bad. Obviously, the card pool is much, much bigger, and you can choose from various cards for various situations. So I always find the fine-tuning aspect of playing 5-color decks pretty interesting. Then again, I also want to make sure that I don't need to pay too many pips for my 2-drops, 3-drops whatsoever. Moloch is already a card which mostly comes down for turn 3 or turn 4, dependent on what your opponent brings down. But here you already have 2 pips, and most of the cards have like different pips. Green is more or less the base color, so it's fine to hardcast Endurance from time to time. This is a card that is a bit debatable in the deck, I would say. But back then, Rogak was still here, so I decided to pack some cheap graveyard interaction that I can cheat from time to time. Felia is here for the Flicker shenanigans. Orcish Bowmaster also a great card against a control matchup. Then we have the Kavu going a bit into the domain direction. That, yeah, it's definitely a thing. Sometimes you have this guy enabled on turn 2. You bring it down on turn 2, and turn 3 it's already a 5/5 with decent effects, I would say. You don't necessarily benefit that much from the discard too often, but rather from the incidental graveyard hate again. And we have Voice, more or less an auto-include in my opinion. Protects your cast of any card from counter magic while also being a good aggressive buddy. Then over to the 3-drops, we have Barrowgoyf, we have Bogotroller as and Witch Enchanter as slots for potential lands rather. But again, as I said, there was Rogak, and initially it was I thought it was rather important to go for more graveyard hate. Also, there's Lumra, there are more decks. It was not only Rogak, but that was something to keep in mind. Phoenix is a really, really powerful card. We see it almost in any aggressive deck, or mid-rangey decks, even giving haste to your commander or any other threat by exiling relatively at cheap cost, I would say, is a good thing. I think we don't have to talk that much about this card. Endurance, I just explained why I included. Opposition Agent goes in the same direction. You have the advantage that sometimes your opponent doesn't really know what to expect, or let's say most of your opponents would expect you to play the controlled variant, which is definitely the better variant. But then, you bring down the Dork on turn 1, and your opponent looks a bit confused already. And if you leave 3 mana open, it does not necessarily mean that you have a Flash Buddy, but rather that you really couldn't find anything to cast now, which is very unlikely. I mean, you might have some interaction, but it's not necessarily the case that your opponent definitely knows about an opposition agent. And again, in a metagame where people are searching the libraries quite a lot of times, this is just a good card. Then we have Flage, which acts a bit as a second win condition together, with the shrines, or if the shrine plan doesn't come through, then there is Flage at some point. Deadpool is here for obvious reasons. It's an incredible card, really, really good. We have the first shrine, it's Go Shintai, which is at face value not necessarily the best card. In this deck, however, if you get to enable any of those flicker shenanigans, and you bring down this guy, especially in combination with the Sanctum that can search things, it will add 2 shrines to your shrine count immediately, and all of the effects that I'm playing, they will trigger at the beginning of my main phase, which means I will draw more cards, I will drain more life immediately, and that's why I thought this guy is pretty cool. Also, in combination with the big Sanctum, it means that reaching the last ability usually goes a bit faster. Omnav is here as a bit of a, I would say, slot that I included because I thought the card would fit into the 99. Maybe it's a card that you want to establish a bit faster than on turn 4. Sometimes you can do that with the help of the Dorks or the ramp that I included. But I have to be honest, after playing the deck for a while, that's probably one of the cards that I would cut. A benefit is definitely that you can pitch it to the free spells. And sometimes you can make some shenanigans with the landfall abilities, and you have lots of mana to spend for your things. But then again, the activated ability of HEI BAI is not really relevant in either of the variants, either the control variant or the mid-range variant here. So yeah, it's a bit cute. I would have not expected to say that, but Omnav seems not to be the greatest card, at least in this pile, in 2026. Then we go over to Pyrogoyf. No explanation needed. We have Witch Enchanter. Sometimes a useful front side, sometimes it's just a land. And the top end is Fury, Solitude, those 2 free spells, as well as the Chaos Defiler. And of course, we have added, for fun, the Sign of Draco. I talked about the domain plan earlier a little bit. And the Kavu is definitely a card that goes into more decks. Sign of Draco is something that you don't see too often. And it's not necessarily the craziest card, but again, as I said, initially the deck was built to have some fun. And yeah, I thought, well, let's play 5 color and give it a try. You have lots of creatures, and the effects will apply to most of them, or more or less all of those creatures. It is a bit hard from time to time to cast this guy for 2 on curve, because it means either your opponent has like an Urborg laying down and you have the rest of the 4 colors, or Yavimaya Hollow, which is rather rare, or you have Triumphs in the deck, which is not really the case, since I want to cast I play 1 Triumph, but usually I want to cast my 1-drops, which there are quite a few. This card is probably not something that you would add in a competitive deck. It's more like a include, because I have the card. I wanted to test it, and here we go. I think I would end up cutting it again, because in some situations it's just too clunky. The body itself is okay if you play it for 2, but you'd never want to play it for 4, so you basically have to play it for 2. If there are some Blood Moon effects and things like that, then this card is basically dead in your hand, because you can also not pitch it to anything. It's a fun include, and it did its job, but I wouldn't play it again, I would say. Over to the sorceries. Not too many special things. We have Oust, we have Pending in a 5-color deck. That's costly, but still very efficient, because it deals with all types of permanents. We have Thoughtseize, DT 4th, the usual mid-range stuff, and then I intentionally added Lore and 3 visits, as well as the Rumble. Rumble is quite cool in combination with the Goyfs and also the Phoenix, as well as Flage. But, it's more about bringing down HEI BAI on turn 3, and those 2 spells go in the same direction. And here I have another domain spell, which I think is one of the better ones, because you might end up in situations where your opponent is at 5 and they feel safe. The Comet math is looking not too good, because they provide too many blockers and stuff, and they feel safe. But if they don't have any counter magic and you have the spell in hand, then it can win you games, or also deal with some nasty big threats instead. Over to the instance. We have not only Ephemerate as definitely the best flicker spells, but we also play Cloud Shift and Essence Flux. As you've seen, I have lots of creatures with EDB effects, or some. I wouldn't say lots of creatures, but let's say Omnath here is definitely cool with EDBs and the higher end things. Scamming these 2 is definitely pretty good. Then again, most of the time, I'm saving it for HEI BAI to get several shrines. Also, if you bring down some of them, I only have 3 or 4 with the Go Shintai. If you manage to bring them down, enchantment is usually something that is rather hard to deal with. So your opponent would either have to have specific interaction or bounce those shrines. So most of the time it feels worth it to go for that. You can not really use those flicker spells as a protection spell for HEI BAI, because your opponent will be more focused on killing the other threats that you bring down, since once this guy resolved, it's a 4/4 and it doesn't do much, and they don't necessarily want to reset it, so you get another trigger to go for more shrines. But you can just use it proactively in any given situation. And cool thing, it's a spirit, so Essence Flux will grant a +1/+1 counter. Then we have a couple of removal spells, all the way up to Fire Covenant, a card that I had in the binder for quite some time, and I thought I will give it a try. Yeah, it's I would say it's not up to today's standards. The card is just too bad. I mean the drawback of paying so much life in order to get rid of those big threats is just too much. I think back then when you played the card 5 or 6 years ago, threats were um, of lower quality for higher mana, so this card was much better. These days it's just too crazy. You know, your opponent has like, I don't know, a Barrow. If let's say you play against Slamfoot, they have a Barrow. If they have an Emperor and something else on board, and you have to pay 10 life in order to get rid of 3 creatures, it's just not worth it. Utopia Sprawl is the one and only non-creature dork inside. I have lots of forests to search for, and this one fixes the color quite good, quite well. We have the Airbender Ascension, which is probably the most powerful flicker spell in combination with a couple of those creatures. If you have Ascend triggered early, then you will get more tokens. Tokens will trigger the Ascension, and then you can flicker HEI BAI all over again. So this is definitely one of the best lineups, I would say. If you get this thing to 4 counters, you can flicker your bear all over again. Then you will, depending on the lineup, this can end up in a win in the next upkeep, because if you have Go Shintai and then you have others enter later, it means you will always produce another shrine token, and once you are at 6 shrines, the Sanctum of All will trigger, or will let all these effects trigger twice. So the Stonefang Sanctum is actually draining for 12 at least, and that's quite a cool thing. We have Animate Dead here. Thought behind that is, again, a little bit of self-mill, and once this guy is handled, I might let it go to the graveyard, get it back. I think in a deck like this, Animate Dead is a fine card. First or second Sanctum is this one. It was also a motivation for me to build a deck, because I thought, yeah, I mean, the control variant is playing those two as well as the blue Honden, but it doesn't make any use of this one, and I think it's not too bad. I mean, if you bring it down, it's a Sanctum that you can play early on. Not too bad if you play that on turn 2. It's comparably bad to what your opponent does. If you're playing against an aggressive deck and you answer their Ajani or whatsoever with a turn 2 Sanctum, it's comparably bad for sure. But in general, I would say it fits this overall game plan. And I was a bit of a fan of this card, so I wanted to give it a try, and it turned out to be quite good in this pile. Then we have Fable, some card selection. Treasure token helps to bring down HEI BAI earlier, or at least enable the interaction of HEI BAI into Flicker, having multiple triggers. Quite cool. Then there is another Flicker, it's Touch the Spirit Realm, which was also played in a couple of control lists, but I think it turned out that this is not a card that you want to play in a 4 or 5 color control deck, since the relevant, quote unquote, relevant part on the card is sorcery speed, and it's way too expensive for what the deck is trying to achieve. We have P-Wave as an obvious include. Then there are the 2, the blue and the 5 color Sanctum. And we have another domain card. It's, surprise, Leyline Binding. Looking at the land base, it's not too special, though I think designing those 5 color land bases is always quite difficult. And, there are a lot of nuances to look at. I ended up playing this one Jetmir's Garden because, as I said, I mean, white is not represented that much. I could have also gone for the Jund color, but since I felt white is like it is actually not the 4th color. I think red is much more of the 4th color. It shares the same spot as with black, but I felt like from curve, if you're looking at the curve, then the spells including those pips, you will cast them earlier in comparison to the spells that would be black, apart from some of the interaction spells and the Thoughtseize. DT can be cast on turn 2, but DT is a card that you sometimes want to wait for to get more information, and especially in a pile like this, it most often ends up in a reactive play rather than in a proactive play. So yeah, definitely room for improvement here. It felt like I was doing good with the mana base, but as I said, it's always rather difficult to design them for decks like that. And that's about it. You will see a couple of games for me trying to fight meta decks. I had lots of fun piloting this deck. I had a couple of really cool matches, and it was just more like a fun project. I really enjoyed playing the deck. It's nothing that I would recommend you to play at any big tournament or something. You should definitely go for the control bear. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little look at the panda, and we will see each other over at the focus sessions. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and see you next time.